Silas Marlowe didn't even look at his daughter when he said it. He was counting the cattle, 30 head, big and brown, lowing in the morning dust. And Eliza was standing 10 feet behind him with a feed sack she'd been carrying since before sunrise. She had heard pieces of it the night before through the thin wall of the farmhouse. Her father's voice, low and urgent, the other man's voice, flat as a blade. But she hadn't let herself believe it until this moment, watching her father's lips move as he counted livestock like she wasn't there. 30, Silas said. He turned around and looked at Colton Voss, not at her. We got a deal. Colton Voss nodded once. He looked at Eliza the way a man looks at a fence post he's trying to decide whether it'll hold weight. Eliza's hands tightened on the feed sack. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Her own father had just traded her for cattle, and he still hadn't looked her in the eye. If you've ever been told, without words, without a single spoken sentence, that you are worth less than the ground beneath your feet, then you already know what Eliza Marlowe felt standing in that yard. And if you've never felt it, then stay with this story. Because what this woman built from that moment forward will shake something loose in your chest that you didn't know was stuck. Before we go further, if this kind of story moves you, if you've ever rooted for the person everyone counted out, then subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. We tell stories like this every week, stories about people who were written off and came back swinging. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that dusty yard in 1879 and watch a girl no one wanted become a woman no one could stop. Eliza Marlowe had been the wrong kind of daughter since the day she was born. That was the unspoken understanding in the Marlowe household, settled into the walls of the farmhouse, the way old smoke settles into curtains. You stop noticing it's there, but it never goes away. Her mother, gone since Eliza was 11, had been a small, pretty woman with quick eyes and a laugh that made men tip their hats. Her two younger sisters, Dora and May, had inherited that smallness, that prettiness, that particular talent for making people comfortable without trying. Eliza had inherited her father's height and her grandfather's shoulders and a kind of stillness that other people mistook for stupidity. She was not stupid. She had taught herself to read from a Bible that belonged to a woman 2 farms over who died of fever when Eliza was 13, trading 3 weeks of fence-mending work for the book, and then spending every spare evening with it in her lap, sounding out words until they stopped being shapes and started being things. She kept a ledger, her own, not her father's, in which she tracked the farm's output and expenses in handwriting that was cramped but accurate, and she had known for 2 years before her father admitted it to himself that the Marlowe farm was dying. The soil in this particular stretch of Hill County, Texas, had never been generous, but it had been manageable. Then the western creek shifted, the way creeks do, and the lower pasture stopped getting water, and the cattle they'd built their modest savings around started losing weight, and then started dying. And Silas Marlowe, who was a proud man in the way that men who've never had much to be proud of are proud, fiercely, irrationally, with no mechanism for adjustment, responded to each new disaster by doubling down on the decisions that had caused it. He borrowed against the land. He bought cattle he couldn't feed. He turned down the offer from his neighbor Deacon Willis to share a well because accepting help felt like surrender. And by the time Eliza was 19 and her sisters were 16 and 14, the farm was not dying anymore. It was dead. Harlan Crow had arrived in Hill County 2 years earlier with money that seemed to have no source and an appetite for land that seemed to have no limit. He was a big man, not in height, but in presence. The kind of man who takes up more space than his body actually occupies, who enters a room and immediately makes everyone else in it feel like they're standing wrong. He wore his suits in a way that made other men aware of their own clothing. He smiled constantly, which should have been warm but wasn't, because his smiles never reached the places smiles are supposed to reach. He'd bought the Patterson place first, then the old Rigby homestead, then 3 parcels on the northern ridge that nobody had figured out how to farm. Each purchase came after a period of quiet difficulty for the seller. A fence that kept getting cut, livestock that kept getting sick, water that stopped tasting right. Nobody could prove anything. Crow was always sympathetic, always first to offer a fair price, always made you feel like selling to him was your own idea. When the Marlowe cattle started dying, Silas didn't connect it to Crow. Silas didn't connect much of anything to much of anything, which was part of how he'd gotten to where he was. He saw Crow's offer as salvation, and he spent 3 weeks negotiating what he believed was a rescue. What he got was 30 cattle and the continued right to work his own land as a tenant. And what Crow got, written into the agreement in language Silas couldn't fully parse, was a lien that would convert to full ownership the moment the Marlowes missed a single payment. But there was another piece of the agreement, one that Crow had suggested almost as an afterthought, in the easy, throwaway manner of a man accustomed to getting what he wants without appearing to want it. "I've got a man," Crow had said. "Colton Voss. Lost his wife this past spring. 5 children. Place out past Blackthorn Creek. Good man, but he needs stabilizing. Needs a woman who can work. Not a delicate thing." He'd paused, and his eyes had moved to Eliza, who was standing in the corner of her father's kitchen where she'd been listening to the whole conversation while she scrubbed a pot. "I understand you've got a daughter who's capable." Silas had looked at Eliza then. That one look. Assessment, not affection. "What's in it for me?" he'd asked. "I'll add 10 cattle to the agreement," Crow had said, "and I'll call the first payment deferred 6 months. 10 cattle. 6 months. That was what she was worth to her father. That was the math he'd done, quickly, without visible hesitation. Eliza had kept scrubbing the pot. Her hands had kept moving. She hadn't cried. She'd used up most of her capacity for crying about her father somewhere around age 14. But something had shifted in her chest. Some final load-bearing wall that had been leaning for years had come quietly down, and in the space where it had been she felt something cold and clear and very still. She had known, in the abstract, that her father didn't love her the way fathers were supposed to love daughters. She had not known, until that moment, that he didn't think of her as a person at all. The next morning, with her one bag packed and her ledger tucked inside it, Eliza walked out of the only home she'd ever known and climbed up onto the seat of Colton Voss's wagon without being helped and without looking back. Colton Voss said nothing. He clicked his tongue at the horses and turned the wagon north. They drove for 2 hours without speaking. Eliza spent the first hour watching the land, the way the scrub brush thinned and thickened, the quality of the soil where it showed through the grass, the angle of the light. She was already taking inventory, already assessing. It was the thing she did when everything else fell away. She looked at what was in front of her and she tried to understand its structure, its needs, its potential. She did it with farms, and she did it with people, and she had been doing it her whole life without knowing that it was a skill. After an hour of silence, she said, "How many acres?" Colton glanced at her sideways. I was a lean man, not quite 40, with a face that had been weathered past the age it actually was, and eyes that were a complicated color. Something between gray and green that changed depending on what he was looking at. He was not unkind looking. I was the kind of man who had probably been easy to be around once, and had stopped being easy somewhere along the way. 412, he said. Good grazing in the north quarter. The rest is rough. How rough? Rough enough. Another silence. Then she said, The children. How old? He exhaled. Jace is 16. Then Thomas, he's 14. Claire is 11. Hank is 8. Rosie just turned 6. Their mother, Eliza said. When did she pass? His jaw tightened. March. 7 months ago. The wound was not old. I'm not here to replace her, Eliza said. She said it plainly, without softness, but also without coldness. I want to be clear about that. He looked at her again, longer this time. Then what are you here for? She thought about that for a moment, the honest question of it, underneath the surface of whatever defensive thing he'd meant it as. To work, she said, to keep the place running, to make sure your children have what they need. She paused. I'm not looking for anything else from you. It was more than she'd said in a row to anyone in years. She could feel the unfamiliarity of it in her throat. Colton Voss turned back to the road. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in his shoulders shifted. Some bracing went out of them, fractionally. Fair enough, he said. They didn't speak again until they reached the ranch. The first thing she saw was that the fence along the south approach was down in 3 places. The second thing she saw was a child, Thomas, she would learn, sitting on the porch roof for no apparent reason. The third thing she saw was that the kitchen garden had not been tended in months. The plants dried to straw and the bed choked with weeds. The children were assembled in the yard when the wagon pulled in, not to welcome her but to look at her, which was different. Jace stood in front with his arms crossed and an expression on his face that Eliza recognized immediately. It was the expression her father wore when he was getting ready to blame someone for something. He was big for 16, broader than Colton, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were doing rapid, unfriendly calculations. "So you're the one," he said. Eliza climbed down from the wagon without help. She was taller than she'd looked sitting down, and she saw Jace register that, a small flicker of recalibration that he immediately suppressed. "I'm Eliza," she said. "You're Jace." "I know who I am." "Good," she said. "That's one thing settled." She turned to the others. Thomas had come down off the roof and was standing slightly behind his brother, trying to look as hostile as Jace and mostly succeeding. Clara was watching Eliza with the direct, unsettling stare of an 11-year-old who had decided to collect data before forming an opinion. Hank was looking at her bag. Rosie was half hidden behind Clara, one hand gripping her older sister's dress. Eliza looked at Rosie for a moment. Rosie was small for 6. Too small, the way children get small when they've been sad for a long time and don't have the appetite for growing. She had her father's complicated colored eyes, and her hair was not brushed, and there was a smear of something on her chin that had been there long enough to dry. "Hi," Eliza said to her. Rosie pressed closer to Clara and said nothing. Eliza picked up her bag. "Where's my room?" she asked Colton. He showed her a room off the back of the house that had been used for storage and still mostly was. There was a cot against one wall, and a window that looked out over the north pasture and a smell of old wood and mouse that would need addressing. It was smaller than the room she'd shared with her sisters. It was entirely her own. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and left. She unpacked her one bag. She set her ledger on the windowsill. She sat on the cot for 30 seconds, which was as long as she permitted herself for anything that wasn't productive, and then she got up and went to look at the kitchen. The kitchen was a disaster. Not a dramatic one, not broken crockery or burnt walls, but the slow, grinding disaster of a space that has been managed by people who are grieving and overwhelmed and have lost track of which problems to solve first. Flour bin nearly empty, salt low. Dried beans, which was fine. A side of salt pork that was going to need to be used in the next day or two or thrown out. A cast iron pan with old grease in it that had gone rancid. She found an apron on a hook and put it on. She was elbow deep in cold water with the pan when she heard Jace's voice behind her. "That's not your kitchen." She didn't stop scrubbing. "It is now." "We don't need you here." "Your salt pork is about to turn," she said. "You have beans but no cornmeal, and whatever your flour situation is, you're a week out from having none. You need me, or someone like me." She looked over her shoulder at him. "If you've got someone else in mind, now's the time." He stared at her. His jaw was working. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," she said, and she meant it. "I'm not trying to take your mother's place or run your father's house or tell you how to live. I'm trying to make sure you and your brother and your sisters eat next week. That's it." Something moved across his face, something young and hurt that he was trying very hard to bury under the hostility. "She's only been gone 7 months," he said. His voice had a crack in it that he immediately clamped down on. "I know," Eliza said. She said it quietly, without the shape of an apology, but with the weight of one. "I know she has." She turned back to the pan. Jace stood there for another long moment, and then she heard his boots on the floor going away. That was how the first evening went. She cooked the salt pork with beans and a small pot of rice she found in the back of a cupboard, and she set it on the table, and the family ate without speaking. And afterward she washed the dishes herself because no one offered and she didn't ask. And then she went to her room and lay on the cot in the dark and thought about what needed doing and in what order. The fences were first. You couldn't run cattle on a range with open fences. She was up before dawn. Colton found her at the tool shed an hour after first light, sorting through what was there. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Inventory," she said without looking up. "You've got 3 good fence posts and about 15 that need replacing, and whoever sharpened these tools last did it wrong." She held up a post hole digger. "You want the fence along the south approach fixed, you're going to need to go to town for posts. Or you can split your own if you've got the timber. I saw a stand of cedar about half a mile east that'd do." Colton was quiet for a moment. You know how to split fence posts? She set down the post hole digger and looked at him. Mr. Voss, I have been running my father's farm for the last 4 years. I know how to do most things. The things I don't know, I figure out. She picked up the digger again. The fence along the south is what needs addressing first. After that, the kitchen garden. But that's secondary. After that, we should look at the winter feed situation, because if you're expecting to keep cattle through January on what I've seen so far, you're going to be short. He stared at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not hostile, not warm, somewhere in between. All right, he said. All right, she agreed, and went back to sorting. The first week was the kind of hard that doesn't have drama in it, just the grinding, physical, relentless kind that wears your hands to cracks and your muscles to a constant low ache. She split fence posts with a maul and a wedge in the cool of the early morning. She reset fence lines in the afternoon heat. She cooked in the evenings and cleaned up after, and somewhere in between she found small windows of time to start reclaiming the kitchen garden, pulling weeds, turning soil, assessing what might still be worth saving this late in the season. The children watched her. They were not helping, but they were watching. Thomas was the easier of the two older boys. She'd figured out quickly, not because he was kinder, but because he was more honest about his curiosity. He would drift near whatever she was doing and find some excuse to be there, pretending to look for something or check something, and she let him do it without comment. On the 4th day, he picked up a fence post without being asked and carried it to where she was working, and she said thank you without making anything of it, and he grunted and walked away, and that was progress. Clara came to the kitchen on the 3rd evening and stood in the doorway. Do you want to help? Eliza asked, not looking up from the dough she was working. I'm 11, Clara said, as if that were either an explanation or an objection. I know. Can you peel potatoes? A pause. Yes. Potatoes are in that box there. Clara got the potatoes. She sat at the kitchen table and peeled them with surprising efficiency, and they worked in silence for 20 minutes, and Eliza thought, this one is going to be all right. Rosie had not spoken to her yet. Not once. She watched from doorways and from behind furniture and from the far side of rooms with those big, quiet eyes that saw more than anyone knew. Eliza did not push her. She left small things in Rosie's path, a piece of bread with the good crust, a cup of warm milk set on the table just before the child drifted past, and did not watch to see if they were taken. On the 6th day, Jace picked a fight. He did it properly. Not random cruelty, but planned provocation, the kind that knows exactly which nerve to find. Eliza had been rehanging a kitchen cabinet door that had been off its upper hinge for apparently months, based on the pattern of wear on the frame, and she had the door balanced on her knee and the screwdriver in her hand when Jace came in and said, in a voice designed to be heard, "My father should have gotten more than 30 cattle." The cabinet door slipped on her knee. She caught it. She did not respond immediately. She finished seating the screw. She set the screwdriver down. She lowered the door, checked that the hinge was seated properly, and opened and closed the cabinet twice. Then she looked at Jace, who was watching her with his arms crossed and his jaw set, ready for anger. He had set up a target and thrown the rock and was waiting for the glass to break. She said, "You might be right." He blinked. "That was your father's decision and your father's negotiation, and I don't have an opinion about it either way." She picked up the screwdriver again. "But I'll tell you what I do know. I'm here. That's not changing, and you can spend the next year making sure every hour of that is miserable for both of us, or you can make something different out of it. That's your choice, not mine." Jace's mouth opened, closed. "Your hinge on that upper bedroom door is going too," she said. "You want me to fix it?" He looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. "I don't need you to fix my door," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. "All right." She moved to the next cabinet. "Let me know if you change your mind." He didn't slam the door when he left. She considered that meaningful. The end of the first week brought the first real crisis, and it came, as crises often do, from a direction she hadn't been watching. She was at the creek, the northern one, past the cedar stand, filling buckets, because the yard pump needed a new leather cup that Colton hadn't gotten around to fetching from town. When she noticed the water, she noticed it first by smell. There was something underneath the usual smell of creek water, something mineral and wrong, the way metal smells when it's been sitting in heat. She set down her buckets and crouched at the bank and looked at the surface, which looked fine, clear, moving, nothing visible. And then she put her hand in and held it there, and when she pulled it out, her skin had a slight oily quality that it shouldn't have. She didn't fill the buckets. She walked back to the ranch and went to find Colton, and she told him what she'd found, and she watched his face go through several expressions in quick succession: disbelief, concern, a flicker of something that might have been recognition, before settling into a flat kind of worry. "Cattle been drinking from that creek," he said. "I know. When did they last show signs?" "2 weeks back, I lost a heifer, put it down to bad grass." "It's not the grass," she said. He looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because the grass in your north pasture is fine. I checked it the second day." "Habit. Your soil's not the problem, your water is." She paused. "My father's cattle went the same way before I got here. He lost 8 head over the summer. Everybody said it was the heat." She said it without emphasis, just laying the fact down on the table between them. "Someone's putting something in your water, Mr. Voss." The silence that followed had a particular quality. The silence of a man hearing something that explains things he hasn't been able to explain and doesn't want the explanation to mean what it means. "That'd be a hell of a thing to prove," he said. "Yes," she said. "It would." She walked back to the kitchen and started dinner, but her mind was already somewhere else, moving through implications, running the arithmetic of a problem she didn't yet have enough information to solve. She thought about her father's farm. She thought about Crow's easy sympathy and his ready offers. She thought about the other farms she'd heard mentioned in that conversation, the Patterson place, the Rigby homestead. She thought about what kind of man goes to the trouble of poisoning a creek. And she thought, this is not over. Whatever this is, it is not over. That night, after the children were in bed, she sat at the kitchen table with her ledger, and she wrote down everything she'd observed about the water, the timing, the symptoms. She wrote it in her cramped, accurate hand, the way she wrote everything. Not beautifully, but completely. Colton came through on his way to check the barn, as he did every night, and he stopped when he saw her writing. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Keeping track," she said. He looked at the ledger for a moment, then at her. "You do that a lot," he said. "Keep track." "Someone has to." He started to say something, stopped, started again. "My wife, Margaret. She used to keep records too, not like that. Letters, mostly. Things she wanted to remember." It was the first time he'd said his wife's name to her. She could hear what it cost him. "She sounds like she was a smart woman," Eliza said. "She was," he said, simply, without decoration. "She was the smartest person I ever knew." He went out to the barn. Eliza sat with that for a moment, and then she turned back to her ledger and kept writing. And outside the Texas night pressed against the windows, and somewhere under the land and the water and the ordinary weight of daily survival, something old and dangerous waited in the dark. She didn't know yet what Margaret Voss had known, but she was already, without knowing it, following the same path. The water was the thing that kept her up at night. Not the children, not the fences, not the slow accumulation of 1,000 tasks that needed doing before winter arrived and made half of them impossible. Those things she could manage. She had always been able to manage things that had edges, things with clear dimensions and knowable solutions. But the water had no edges yet. It was a shape she couldn't see the whole of, and that bothered her in a way that nothing else on the ranch did. She stopped using the North Creek. She told Colton, and he told the children, and nobody argued because nobody wanted to argue with a woman who could explain exactly what an oily mineral residue meant for cattle intestines, which she did, in plain language, over supper, the second night after she'd found it. Hank had stopped eating midway through her explanation. Thomas had leaned forward. Jace had stared at the table. They switched to the southern well, which meant hauling water twice as far for the cattle and 3 times as far for the house. It meant Eliza was up an hour earlier every morning, and an hour earlier was not something she had to spare. But she did it because the alternative was losing cattle they couldn't afford to lose, and she had done the math on what that would mean for this family going into winter, and the math was not acceptable. The second week on the Voss ranch was different from the first in ways she hadn't anticipated. The first week she'd been a stranger doing work. The second week she was still a stranger, but she was a stranger who had fixed the pump. The leather cup had needed replacing, which meant a trip to town she hadn't been able to avoid. And she'd taken the wagon herself at 5 in the morning and been back by 8 with the part and 3 other things she'd noticed were needed and purchased with her own coins. The small amount her mother had left her that Silas had somehow not gotten his hands on. The pump worked by 9 o'clock. Hank had stood watching her assemble it with the focused attention of a child who is doing calculations about what a person is. "How'd you know how to do that?" he'd asked. "I figured it out," she said. She handed him the wrench. "Put this back where you found it." He took it with both hands and ran. Clara was in the kitchen with her most mornings now, not always helping, sometimes just there, sitting at the table with some mending or just sitting, but present in a way that had shifted from watching to something more like companionship. Eliza didn't push that either. She let the girl come and go as she chose, and she talked when Clara seemed to want talking and was quiet when she didn't, and she answered questions directly when they came. "Did you want to come here?" Clara asked one morning, out of nowhere, not looking up from the sock she was darning. Eliza was cutting salt pork into the pot. She considered lying, but not dramatically, just the small social lie of softening, and decided against it. "No," she said. Clara looked up. "I didn't have much of a choice about it," Eliza said. "But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving, and those two things are both true at the same time." She turned back to the pot. "Does that bother you?" Clara thought about it, actually thought, in the serious way she had that was older than 11, and probably always had been. "No," she said. "I think it's more honest than most things people say." Eliza almost smiled. "Your mother raised you right." She said it before she thought about whether she should, and then she held herself still, waiting for the reaction. Clara went quiet for a moment, a particular quiet, like a held breath. "She did," Clara said. Her voice was small. "She really did." They didn't talk again for an hour, and when they did, it was about supper. Thomas had started showing up to wherever Eliza was working in the mornings, not offering to help exactly, but positioning himself within range of being asked. She began to ask. She asked in a way that left room for refusal, which was the only way asking worked with teenage boys who were trying to maintain a posture of independence while clearly wanting to be useful. He was strong, and he was willing once asked, and he had his father's instinctive understanding of the land. He could read weather in the sky with an accuracy that made Eliza raise her eyebrows the first time she saw it. "Going to rain tonight," he said one afternoon, looking west at clouds that Eliza had not yet classified as threatening. "You sure? See how the bottoms of those clouds are flat? And the way the air smells right now?" He shrugged. "My mom taught me. She always knew." It rained that night. Not hard, but enough that Eliza was glad she'd moved the cutwood to the covered lean-to that afternoon after Thomas's forecast. She didn't tell him she'd moved it because of what he said. She didn't need to. He noticed that the wood was dry the next morning, and she caught him looking at it, and the look on his face was complicated in the good way. Jace was not warming. She had not expected him to, and she didn't need him to. She had enough traction with the other children and enough working relationship with Colton to function without Jace's goodwill. But she watched him, because watching people was something she'd done her whole life. And what she watched worried her in a specific way that wasn't about the ranch. He was doing too much. I was waking before she did. She knew because she was awake at 4:30, and she could already hear him moving on the other side of the house. And working until dark, and then working after dark by lantern light. She'd seen it from her window, the small orange glow moving around the barn at 9, 10 o'clock at night. He was eating less than he should. He had a set to his jaw that wasn't teenage stubbornness. It was the jaw of a person who is holding themselves together through an act of constant, exhausting will. She recognized it because it was her own jaw, more or less, and she knew what it cost. She didn't say anything to him directly. She had learned, with Jace, that direct was the wrong instrument. It activated his defenses before whatever she was trying to reach him with could get through. Instead, when she noticed the lantern light late on a Wednesday night, she left a tin cup of coffee and a piece of the cornbread she'd made that evening on the porch step outside the barn door, where he'd find it when he came in. In the morning, the cup and plate were clean and set back on the step. That was all. But it was something. The second significant development of that week came from an unexpected direction, which was Colton Voss himself. He was not an easy man to understand. He was not trying to be difficult. She had, by this point, managed to get a fairly clear picture of his character, and difficulty for its own sake was not part of it. He was private the way people get private after loss, when everything that mattered is suddenly interior and the exterior world is just surfaces you move through. He worked hard. He was fair with the children, if not warm. Warmth seemed to require energy he didn't currently have, and she understood that. He said what he meant. He didn't pretend things were all right that weren't. What she hadn't expected was that he paid attention. She found this out because on the Thursday of the second week, she came back from the south pasture in the middle of the afternoon to find that the broken shelf bracket in the kitchen, the one she'd been intending to fix herself but hadn't gotten to, had been repaired. Cleanly. Better than she would have done it, actually, with a proper metal bracket instead of the wedge and nail solution she'd been planning. She stood and looked at the shelf for a moment. At supper, she said, "Thank you for the shelf." Colton nodded without looking up from his plate. "How long had you been meaning to fix it?" she asked. A pause. "Since March. Since Margaret died." She nodded and didn't say anything else. But that night, going over her ledger, she added a small note in the margin. Not about the ranch, just 2 words, paying attention. It seemed important to record. The trouble with Jace came to a head in the middle of the second week, and it came from a direction she'd been watching for but couldn't entirely prevent. She was in the barn helping Colton with a calf that had come into the world with a hind leg in the wrong position, a problem that needed 2 people and some degree of coordination and had necessitated the closest she and Colton had been to each other since she'd arrived. The work was messy and necessary and left no room for anything except the task. And afterward they'd stood up in the hay smell of the barn with their sleeves rolled up and their hands needing washing, and Colton had said quietly, "You've done that before." "My father's 3rd cow, spring of 16, she said. "Learned the wrong way first and then the right way. The wrong way almost lose the calf? Lost the calf," she said. "Right way saved the next 3. Something shifted in his face. Not warmth, exactly, but a kind of respect that was different from what had been there before. Less wary. More direct. It was the precise moment that Jace chose to appear in the barn doorway. She didn't know, afterward, how long he'd been standing there or how much he'd seen. What she knew was that the expression on his face when she noticed him was not hostility. It was something more complicated and more painful. A teenage boy's terrifying mix of jealousy and grief and anger that has nowhere rational to land. He looked at his father. He looked at Eliza. He left without a word. Colton closed his eyes briefly. "I'll talk to him." "Not yet," she said. "Give him a day." Colton looked at her. "He's not angry at us," she said. "He's angry because he wants things to be different, and they're not." She picked up her coat from the stall rail. "A day. If it's not better by then, you can talk to him." Colton considered that for a moment. "All right," he said. The next morning, Jace was gone before she was up. He came back at noon with 2 jackrabbits he'd snared, which he dropped on the kitchen table without ceremony. "For supper," he said, to no one in particular. Eliza picked one up and checked it. Properly cleaned, competently done. "Good catch," she said, and started toward the larder for salt. "I know how to clean them," he said, with some of the old edge. "I can see that." She came back with the salt. "You want to help with supper or not?" A long pause. The kind of pause that is a decision being made. "I guess," he said. He stood at the table and cut the rabbits into portions while she prepared the pot, and they worked next to each other in something that was not quite peace, but was something adjacent to it. He was clumsy with the knife. Not bad, just untrained, hacking where he should be slicing. She said nothing. When he handed her a piece and waited, she took it without comment. At supper, Rosie sat next to Eliza for the first time. Not touching her, not speaking to her, but there, deliberately chosen, seat pulled close. Eliza felt the child's warmth on her left side and kept her face neutral and did not make it a thing, because making it a thing would undo it. After supper, Rosie tugged once on Eliza's sleeve. Eliza looked down. "The rabbit was good," Rosie said. Her voice was almost inaudible. "Jace caught them," Eliza said. Rosie considered that. Then she went to find her brother, and Eliza heard from the other room a small child's voice saying something to a teenage boy that made the boy go very quiet for a moment before he answered. She didn't listen to what they said. Some things were not hers to hear. The third week brought the crisis she'd been sensing since she put her hand in the North Creek. It started with a rider. She was working on the east fence when she heard hoofbeats on the access road. Not from town, from the north, which meant from the direction of open range and the properties that lay beyond it. The rider came into view over the low rise. A woman, somewhere around 40, riding hard and alone, which was unusual enough that Eliza straightened up and waited. The woman pulled up short when she saw Eliza, clearly expecting Colton, and then seemed to decide it didn't matter. "Is Voss here?" she asked. She was breathing a little fast, not from the ride. "He's in the north pasture," Eliza said. "I'm Eliza Voss. Can I help?" She hadn't called herself that before. It came out without her deciding on it, and she noted it and filed it away for later consideration. "Ruth Deaver," the woman said. "My husband's got a place east of here, the Deaver homestead. We've been losing cattle 2 months. Something wrong with our East Creek." She looked at Eliza with sharp, tired eyes. "Heard you stopped using your North Creek." Word traveled fast out here. "That's right," Eliza said. "When did yours start?" "Late August. We lost 4 head before we figured out what was happening. My husband thought it was our well, spent 2 weeks digging a new one, but the cattle from the east pasture kept going." Ruth Deaver's jaw tightened. "We can't make winter at this rate." Eliza set down her wire stretcher. "Have you talked to anyone else?" "Other ranchers." "The Holloways lost cattle in July. Wouldn't say from what. The Beckett place, their whole east herd's been sick since September." Ruth looked at her steadily. "We've all got east running water, all of it sourced from the same ridge." Eliza felt the pieces of something begin to arrange themselves, the way puzzle edges find each other before the picture is clear. The ridge north and east. The same ridge where Crow had bought those 3 parcels that nobody had figured out how to farm. "Come to the house," she said. "I want you to talk to my husband." Colton listened to Ruth Deaver with his arms on the table and his face doing the things it did when he was being very still and very careful. When she finished, he looked at Eliza. "You think it's connected," he said. Not a question. "I think it's worth asking what's upstream of every affected ranch," she said. "And who owns the land upstream?" Ruth Deaver was quiet for a moment, then, "Crow bought the ridge parcels 14 months ago, all 3 of them." The name fell into the room like a dropped stone. Nobody said anything for a moment. "He'd have to be putting something in the water deliberate," Colton said. "Yes," Eliza said. That's not just a business going wrong. That's criminal." "Yes," she said again. Ruth Deaver set her hands flat on the table. "My husband wanted to go see Crow directly. I talked him out of it, but I need something to talk him out of it with. Some reason that's better than just bad feeling." "Evidence," Eliza said. "Evidence," Ruth agreed. Colton looked at Eliza for a long moment. She could see him calculating the shape of what this meant. Not just the ranch, not just the water, but the whole structure of risk around it. "If Crow finds out we're looking at him," he said slowly, "things could get worse a lot faster than they were already going." "I know," Eliza said. "He's got men. He's got money. He's got the sheriff in his pocket, near as I can tell." "I know that too." "Then why—" "Because Margaret's children are drinking water from this land," she said. She said it quietly and without any shape of accusation, just the plain fact of it. "And because 3 other families are losing their livelihoods. And because if we don't find out what's happening on that ridge, somebody's going to sell out of desperation, and Crow's going to buy another piece of this valley, and then another, and then one day there won't be anyone left to stop him." Colton was quiet for a very long time. "What do you need?" he said. "I need to know what's on those ridge parcels. Not from town, from up close." She looked at both of them. "And I need to know if anyone else has been watching this. If anyone else has tried to get answers." Ruth Deaver looked at her hands. "Margaret Voss asked me something a few weeks before she passed. She asked me if I'd noticed anything different about the water." The room went very still. Colton's face changed completely. "What?" "She didn't tell me why she was asking. She said she was just curious, that she'd read something." Ruth looked up. "I didn't think much of it at the time. She was already sick. I thought—" She stopped. "I thought she was just talking." Colton pushed back from the table and stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room. Eliza watched him carefully. "She knew," he said. His voice was strange. "She was already sick, and she was trying to figure it out." Maybe, Eliza said. "Or maybe she just had a feeling and was gathering pieces." She paused. "Did she keep notes?" Records? Letters? He turned around. His face was the face of a man being asked something that opens a door he has kept shut. She kept everything, he said. Boxes of it. I couldn't. After she passed, I put it all in the back room. I haven't. He stopped. I haven't opened any of it. Eliza didn't say anything. He looked at her for a long time. All right, he said finally, his voice rough at the edges. All right. Ruth Deaver left an hour later with a promise to have her husband ride over the following week, and with a look on her face that was not quite hope, but was the thing that comes just before hope, when you've been alone with a problem long enough that finding someone else who sees it feels like surviving something. Eliza went to the south fence in the afternoon and worked until dark without stopping, not because it needed doing that badly, but because she needed to move, needed the physical vocabulary of the work to organize the things moving through her mind. The weight of what was gathering around this family and the others, the scale of the deliberateness behind it, was enormous, and she needed to carry it somewhere, and her body was the only place she knew to put that kind of thing. She was washing up at the yard pump when Jace came out of the barn. He stopped when he saw her. For a moment they just looked at each other in the falling dark. Something's wrong, he said. It wasn't a question. He'd have been watching the household longer than she'd been in it, and he knew its currents. She thought about deflecting. She thought about all the reasons not to tell a 16-year-old the full shape of what she was thinking about. Then she thought, he's been getting up before dawn and working until midnight trying to hold this place together by himself. He deserves the truth. Something might be, she said. I'm still trying to understand what. Jace looked at her for a long moment. Is my father in trouble? Not yet, she said, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure it stays that way. Whatever he'd been expecting her to say, it wasn't that. She could see it on his face, the small recalibration, the slight thaw. Not trust, not yet, but the precondition of it. Okay, he said. He went back inside. Eliza stood at the pump for another minute, looking up at a sky crowded with stars that out here you could actually see, all of them burning away up there without any concern for what was happening below. And she thought about Margaret Voss, who had been sick, and who had still been asking questions, who had still been trying to put pieces together. She went inside. She went to her room and opened her ledger to a blank page. At the top she wrote, "What Margaret knew," and underneath that she began to write everything: the water, the ridge, the Deaver cattle, the Holloway losses, the Beckett herd, Crow's land purchases, the timing, the pattern that was not a coincidence because there was too much of it to be a coincidence. She wrote until the lamp needed refilling and wrote after that in the dark until she couldn't see the page. And when she finally stopped, her hand was cramping and her back ached, and she had 4 pages of notes that were still not an answer, but were the shape of a question that could be answered. She fell asleep sitting up and woke at 4 with her face on the ledger and a crick in her neck and the absolute clear-headed certainty, in the way certainty sometimes arrives in those first dark seconds of waking, that the answer she needed was in this house. Margaret had kept everything, and Margaret had been asking questions. And somewhere in those boxes in the back room, in the records of a woman who had died too soon with too much still in her hands, there was something that Harlan Crow had not found. Eliza got up and started the fire and put the coffee on and stood at the kitchen window watching the sky lighten, and she thought, I am not Margaret Voss. I did not know her. I do not have her history or her children's memories of her or the grief that her husband carries like a second skeleton. But I am in her house, and I am following the same thread she was following, and I am not sick. Colton didn't open the boxes that morning. He didn't open them the next morning either, and Eliza didn't push him because she understood the geometry of grief well enough to know that some doors can't be opened on someone else's schedule. She made the coffee. She fed the children. She worked the fence line and hauled water and watched the North Ridge through the clear morning air and thought about Margaret Voss, who had been sick and still asking questions, and she waited. On the 3rd morning, she came into the kitchen before first light and found Colton already there, sitting at the table with a box in front of him and his hands flat on the lid, not opening it, just sitting with it. She went to the stove and put the coffee on and did not say anything. She could hear him breathing. After a while, he said, I don't know what I'm going to find. You don't have to look today, she said. If I don't do it today, I won't do it. His voice was rough and low. I've been not doing it for 7 months. She poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat down across the table. The box between them was a regular pine crate, the kind that apples came in, and the lid was not latched. Margaret had not locked anything. She had trusted someone would come. Colton lifted the lid. Inside were letters, folded papers, what appeared to be pages torn from a journal, and at the bottom a small oilskin packet tied with cord. He lifted things out one at a time, slowly, the way a man handles objects that belong to someone he has not done grieving. Some things he set aside immediately. Personal letters, the children's drawings she'd kept, a pressed flower that had gone to brown and no longer had a color. Those he put back in the box with a care that was painful to watch. What remained on the table were 11 pages of notes in a handwriting that was nothing like Eliza's cramped ledger entries. Margaret's writing was large and urgent, words pressed hard into the paper as if she'd been writing fast, writing while she still could. Eliza reached across and turned the first page so she could read it. The notes were not organized the way Eliza's were, not by category or date or logical sequence. They were the notes of a woman following her instincts, jumping between observations and recording them before they slipped away. A dead calf in October set. East pasture, water from Ridge Creek, same week Holloway lost 2. A conversation overheard in town between Crow's foreman and a man Margaret didn't recognize. Talked about the schedule, talked about the March deadline. Harlan wasn't there, but the foreman said his name 3 times. A notation about a property deed with a page number and a book number, as if she'd looked at a public record. Crow Ridge Parcel 3, acquired May. But Beckett says Crow's man was up there since February, doing what? And on the last page, the one that had been at the bottom, underlined twice, lie. Industrial quantity, Delacroix Supply in Waco, freight receipt, Crow account. Eliza sat back. Colton had been reading over her shoulder. She heard him exhale, a long, controlled exhale, like a man who has just been told something he already knew but had been hoping wasn't true. Lie in the water, he said. Enough of it, over time, doesn't kill cattle immediately, weakens them, makes them sick slow enough that you don't know what you're looking at until you've already lost too many. She kept her eyes on the page. Long enough exposure, you lose the herd. You lose the herd, you can't make your payments, you sell. And Crow's there with a ready offer. He's already got 3 ranches in this valley. At this rate, he'd have 6 by spring. She looked up. Margaret found the freight receipt, an industrial lie shipment billed to his account, delivered to the Ridge parcels. That's not proof of intent by itself, but it's a thread. Pulled hard enough, it unravels. Colton picked up the oilskin packet, untied the cord with fingers that were not entirely steady. Inside was a single folded document, not Margaret's writing this time. A printed receipt, freight company letterhead, Waco date stamp. The consignee line read, H. Crow, Blackthorn Ridge, Hill County TX. The cargo line read, Industrial Alkaline Compound, 400 ploughs, 6 units, 2,400 pounds of industrial lye, delivered to the ridge above every east-running creek in the valley. She was going to take this to someone, Eliza said. She got sick before she could. His voice was flat, but underneath the flatness was something enormous, too large to look at directly. She kept it hidden because she knew if Crow found out she had it. He didn't finish the sentence. Eliza looked at the oilskin packet in his hands. She hid it well. The compartment in the floor of the repair room. I only found it because I was relaying the boards. She built that compartment herself, Colton said quietly. 3 years ago. Said she wanted a place to keep things she didn't want the children getting into. He paused. I thought she meant Christmas presents. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of Margaret Voss, her intelligence, her caution, her terrible timing, the way she had gathered evidence while she was dying and hidden it carefully in the last place Crow would think to look, and then trusted that someone would eventually find it. Eliza picked up the freight receipt very carefully, as if it were something that could break. We need more than this, she said. This is one document. A lawyer could argue it 6 different ways. What else do we need? We need the creek samples. Water from the North Creek tested against the Ridge runoff, something that shows the contamination coming from that direction. We need statements from the other families. The Devers, the Holloways, the Becketts. Written and signed. She set the receipt down. And we need someone to look at those Ridge parcels and tell us exactly what's up there, because a receipt for lie is one thing, finding where it went is another. Colton looked at her steadily. The Ridge parcels. Those are Crow's land. Yes. Going up there without his permission is trespassing, she said. Yes, it is. She met his eyes. Tell me you have a better option. He thought for a moment. We could go to the county assessor. The deeds are public record. Margaret had a book and page number. He tapped the note. If we can pull the deed description, we'd know exactly what's on those parcels legally. That's good, she said. That's something we can do without trespassing, but we still need to know what Crow's actually done up there, not just what the paper says he owns. I know someone, Colton said slowly. Will Tanner. He's a surveyor, been through this county for 20 years. He'd have maps of the ridge drainage, old ones, pre-Crow. If we can show the water table and drainage routes from before his purchase, and then show what's happening downstream now. That's the link, Eliza said. That's how you connect the lye shipment to the contamination. Not just proximity, actual drainage path, documented. She sat forward. Can you get to Tanner without Crow knowing? Will drinks his coffee at the Morrison Hotel every morning at 7. I can be there before that. He paused. Crow's men watch the roads, but they don't watch the hotel dining room. Not yet. Not yet. That was an important qualifier, and they both heard it. How much time do you think we have? She asked. Before Crow knows something's different here? Colton thought about it. Ruth Deaver's husband, Frank. He's not a careful man. If he puts it together that we're all talking to each other. I'll go see Ruth today, Eliza said immediately. Before anything else, tell her Frank needs to stay quiet until we have everything assembled. Colton nodded. Then he looked at her across the table with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. Not the wary assessment of the first weeks, not the working respect that had been growing since the calf and the pump and the fences. Something more direct. Something that had the shape of gratitude but was wider than that. Eliza, he said, and then stopped. Don't, she said, not unkindly. Let's just get it done. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face, but it almost did. She left for the Deaver place an hour later, taking the bay mare and the south route that kept her off the main road. The morning was cold now. Genuinely cold. Not just cool, the first real bite of the season. She rode with Margaret's notes folded inside her coat and the oilskin packet with the freight receipt tucked inside that, against her body where it was warm, and she thought about the timing of all of it. Crow had started buying the valley ranches with a process, poison the water, wait for the losses to mount, buy at a distressed price. The whole operation had a deadline built into it. She could feel that. Winter was part of the calculation. Families with poisoned water and dying cattle going into a hard winter would sell faster, sell cheaper, sell without conditions. The March deadline Margaret had overheard. That was the timeline. Crow wanted the valley locked up by spring. That gave her 4 months, maybe less. Frank Deaver was not pleased to see her. He was a large man with a weather-burned face and the stance of someone who has been told his whole life that the correct response to problems is direct physical confrontation, which was not the worst instinct in a man, but was absolutely the wrong one here. He met her in the yard with his arms crossed and a look that said he'd already made decisions she was about to inconvenience. Ruth told me you were looking into Crow, he said, before she'd fully dismounted. We are, she said. All of us. If we're smart about it. Smart about it. He said it like the words had a bad taste. My cattle are dying. I'm not feeling inclined towards smart. I understand that. I've got half a mind to ride to Crow's place and put the question to him face to face. I know you do, she said. And when you get there, what happens? He denies it. You've got no proof. And now he knows someone is looking. She kept her voice level. His men follow you home. They go through your place looking for anything that connects you to the other families. And anything we've gathered so far disappears. Frank's jaw worked. I've got a freight receipt with his name on it, she said. Signed. I've got water samples. I've got a surveyor who can show the drainage path from his ridge parcels to every affected creek in this valley. I am 4 to 6 weeks away from having something a circuit court judge cannot ignore. She looked at him steadily. Give me 4 to 6 weeks, Mr. Deaver, and you won't need to ride to Crow's place. You'll watch a federal marshal do it for you. Silence. Frank Deaver looked at her for a long time. Who are you? He said. Not hostile, genuinely asking. I'm the woman who's going to make sure your cattle don't die for nothing, she said. That's enough for now. Ruth appeared in the doorway of the house. She'd been listening. She looked at her husband with an expression that was the entire negotiation compressed into a single glance. Frank uncrossed his arms. 6 weeks, he said. Not a day more. I'll do my best, Eliza said, which was honest, and she remounted and started back before he could reconsider. She was 2 miles from the Voss ranch, on the narrow track through the cedar brake, when she heard the horse behind her. Not fast, not pursuing, just following at a distance that a person who wasn't paying attention might not notice. She kept her pace and her direction and didn't look back, and she moved her hand to where the rifle was tucked against the saddle, and she thought, all right, here we are. She turned off the track at the cedar stand and went into the trees and came around in a wide arc and came out behind the rider who had been following her, which was possible because she knew this particular stretch of land now in a way that the follower apparently didn't. The rider was a young man, not much older than Thomas, actually, which surprised her. He was riding a good horse, too good for a ranch hand, and when he pulled up short at finding her behind him instead of ahead of him, his face did something complicated. "Who sent you?" she said. He opened his mouth. "Don't," she said. "We're past that." "Who sent you?" He was not a skilled liar. She could see it in the way his eyes moved. "Nobody. I'm just—" "You've been on this road for 2 miles," she said. "At exactly my pace. Nobody does that by accident." She kept her voice very calm. "I'm not going to hurt you. I want you to carry a message back to whoever it is you're carrying messages for. Can you do that?" He stared at her. "Tell them," she said carefully, "that whatever they think they know about what I'm doing, they don't know all of it, and that the next person they send on this road, I'll know their face." She held his gaze. "That's all. You can go." He went, fast. She watched him until he was out of sight, and then she sat on the mare in the cedar brake for a moment and allowed herself privately the small luxury of fear. Just a minute of it, feeling the actual weight of what she'd stepped into, the real dimensions of the danger. Crow had men watching, had maybe already been watching, maybe had been watching since Ruth Deaver asked around about the water. 1 minute. Then she put it away and rode home. Colton was back from town when she arrived. He had a look on his face. "Tanner says the original survey maps from the ridge drainage are in the county seat at Hillsborough. He can get them, but it takes a week to make the trip properly." He paused. "He also says Crow was in the Morrison Hotel this morning, half an hour after I left. He wasn't there when you spoke to Tanner?" "No, but close enough." His eyes were careful. "I was followed on the way back." "So was I," she said. "Different man?" "Probably. Crow's got at least 3 men I can identify. Likely, more I can't." He was quiet for a moment. "Eliza, he's moving faster than we thought." "Yes." "If he knows we're building something—" "He doesn't know what we have," she said. "Not yet. He knows we're talking to each other. He doesn't know about Margaret's notes or the receipt." She was still in her coat, the document still inside it, and she was aware of that weight against her chest. "We need to get the other family's statements written and witnessed before this window closes. Ruth and Frank Deaver, the Holloways, the Becketts. If we can get all of them to a single location—" "Not here," Colton said immediately. "No, somewhere Crow's men don't watch." They looked at each other. "The Morrison Hotel," Colton said slowly. 3 families coming to town on the same day isn't unusual. Market day is Thursday. If everyone came for market and happened to gather in the back room of the hotel for an hour," she said, "Morrison owes me a favor from before Margaret died. He'd give us the room." "Thursday," she said. 4 days. 4 days, he agreed. It should have been enough time. In a reasonable world, it would have been. But on the second night, Jace woke her at 2 a.m. by pounding on her door, and when she opened it, his face was white in the lantern light. "There's someone in the north pasture," he said. She was dressed and outside in under 2 minutes, which was possible because she had been sleeping in her clothes since the rider in the cedar brake. Colton was already at the pasture fence when she reached him, standing very still and listening. She listened too. Cattle moving. Not the normal night shift of cattle settling. Something purposeful, the particular sound of a herd being directed. "Someone's cutting cattle," Colton said, his voice very low. "Not poisoning, stealing, direct, immediate, designed to do damage that couldn't be reversed or recovered. You could survive poison if you found it in time, could save some of the herd, could get a doctor's statement and call it evidence. But stolen cattle were gone, and winter was coming. And a man with no cattle going into winter was a man who would sell. Colton had his rifle. Eliza went back to the house at a run. But for Thomas, who she shook awake with one hand and said, "Ride to the Deaver place, fast as you can. Tell them cattle are being moved in the north pasture, and we need Frank Deaver and whoever he can bring. Ride now." Thomas was 17 years old, and he had his father's instincts. He did not ask questions. He was on a horse in 4 minutes. Jace was at the pasture fence when she got back, and he had a rifle she hadn't known he owned, and he was watching the darkness with an expression that was not a boy's expression. "How many?" she asked him. "I counted at least 4 horses," he said. "Maybe 5. They've got the west end cut off. 4 or 5 men, at least, in the dark, with cattle moving. Against 2 adults and a teenage boy. Those were not good numbers." "We can't stop them by force," she said. Both Colton and Jace looked at her. "Not tonight. Not with these numbers." She thought fast. "But we can see them. We can get faces, descriptions." She looked at Jace. "You have good eyes in the dark?" "Better than most. There's a rise on the northeast corner of the fence. From there you can see the west gate. Don't get close. Stay low. Stay quiet. Get what you can see. Names if you know them, descriptions if you don't, horse colors, brands if you can read them." She held his eyes. "Do not engage them, no matter what you see. Just watch." Jace nodded once and disappeared into the dark. Colton looked at her. "What are we doing?" "We're letting them think they've got away clean," she said. "And we're building the case." She turned toward the house. "Come on." He followed her inside, and she went straight to her room and got her ledger and sat at the kitchen table and began writing. Everything, from the beginning, dated and ordered. Colton watched her. "What are you doing?" he asked. "What Margaret did," she said, "making sure it exists somewhere even if something happens to us." She looked up. "Is there anywhere on this property that isn't our obvious first place to look?" He understood immediately. "The spring house. There's a loose stone in the east wall. Margaret used it for butter in summer." "Perfect." She kept writing. "When I'm done, we put a copy here and a copy there. Whatever they find in one place, they won't find in the other." She was still writing when Thomas came back with Frank Deaver and 2 of his ranch hands 2 hours later, and by then the cattle were gone. 32 head from the north pasture, not all of them, but enough. And Jace came back from the rise with 6 descriptions and 2 names he'd recognized from town. Crow's men. Both of them. Jace stood in the kitchen with his rifle and his descriptions written on a scrap of paper in handwriting that was large and urgent, and he set the paper on the table next to Eliza's ledger, and for the first time since she'd come to this ranch, he looked at her not with hostility or with wariness or with the complicated grief-anger of a boy trying to be a man. He looked at her like someone who was in the same fight. "Jace," Colton said, "you did well." Jace didn't look at his father. He kept looking at Eliza. "What do we do now?" he asked. She looked at the descriptions. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the window where the sky was just beginning to go gray at the edges, the first thin light of a morning that was going to demand everything she had. "Now," she said, "we stop waiting for Thursday." She looked at Frank Deaver, who was standing by the door with his arms no longer crossed, and his face no longer the face of a man who thought the problem could be solved by riding to Crow's place. "I need the Holloways and the Becketts today," she said. "Not Thursday. Today. Can you get them?" Frank Deaver looked at his hands, looked at the room, looked at Eliza. "I can get them," he said. Outside, the sun came up red over the eastern ridge, the ridge where Crow's parcels sat, where 2,400 pounds of lye had arrived by freight wagon in the dark of some earlier season, where a dead woman's instincts had been proven right by everything that had happened since. Red sky in the morning. Old frontier saying, shepherd's warning. Eliza stood up from the table, rolled her shoulders against the ache in them, and started making coffee because there were people coming and decisions to make, and she was not done yet, not close to done, and the morning could be as red as it liked. The Holloways arrived first before the coffee was fully brewed. Ed Holloway was a small, precise man in his late 50s who had the careful movements of someone who had learned long ago that small men in a big country needed to be deliberate about everything. His wife Agnes came with him, which Eliza hadn't expected. And Agnes turned out to be the kind of woman who walks into a room and immediately understands its architecture, social, physical, emotional, and adjusts herself accordingly. She looked at Eliza once, looked at the kitchen, looked at the children hovering in the doorway, and went to the stove without being asked and took over the coffee. Eliza let her. She needed her hands free. The Becketts came 20 minutes later, Carl and his older son Daniel, and they came hard-faced and tight-jawed because they'd lost 11 head in the past 6 weeks. And Carl Beckett was a man who had built everything he had from nothing and watched it get taken apart piece by piece and had run out of patience for patience. Frank Deaver was already there, sitting at the far end of the table with his hat in his hands, doing the thing men do when they've been talked out of direct action and are not entirely at peace with having been talked out of it. Eliza stood at the head of the table. She had Margaret's notes in front of her, the freight receipt, her own ledger, and Jace's descriptions from the night before. She had not slept. She was aware of this in the way you're aware of a stone in your boot, persistently, without being able to do much about it. "I'm going to tell you everything I know," she said, "and then I'm going to tell you what I think we should do, and then you're going to tell me if you're in. I'm not going to argue with anyone who isn't, but I need to know now, today, because we don't have the time we had yesterday." She told them. All of it. The water, the lie shipment, Margaret's notes, the freight receipt, the cattle theft the night before, Jace's descriptions of Crow's men. She laid it out in the order it made sense rather than the order it happened, because that was how you made people understand the shape of something rather than just its sequence. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. Agnes Holloway spoke first. "How long did that woman spend putting this together?" She meant Margaret. "I don't know exactly," Eliza said. "Months. While she was sick." Agnes set her coffee cup down. Something moved across her face that was not a simple emotion. "All right," she said. "What do you need from us?" Carl Beckett had been looking at the freight receipt for the past 3 minutes, picking it up and setting it down and picking it up again, like a man who needs to keep touching evidence to believe it's real. "This is enough," he said. "This right here, with the water samples, with our cattle records, this is enough to take to a judge." "It might be," Eliza said carefully. "Or Crow's lawyer argues the lie was for legitimate agricultural use, and the water contamination is coincidental, and the cattle theft last night was unrelated parties, and we've got nothing that directly connects him to a deliberate scheme." She paused. "We need the drainage survey. We need the line drawn on paper from his ridge parcels to our water sources. We need Tanner's maps." "Tanner's in Hillsborough," Colton said from his position by the window where he'd been standing the whole time. "I know. How fast can he get there and back?" 6 days minimum. Road's rough this time of year." Ed Holloway cleared his throat. "I've got a nephew in Hillsborough, clerk at the land office. The survey maps Tanner is looking for. My nephew could pull them in a day." Everyone looked at him. "I didn't think of it before," Ed said without apology. "I'm thinking of it now. He can copy them and send them by rider. 3 days if the weather holds." "Can he do it quietly?" Eliza asked. "He can if I write him a letter that explains why quietly matters." Eliza looked at Colton. Colton looked at Ed. "Write the letter," Colton said. That was the first decision. The rest came harder. The question of where to take the evidence was not simple, because the county sheriff was not an option. 3 people in the room had direct observations of Sheriff Nolan's friendly relationship with Crow, which manifested in small ways that added up to something large. The way Nolan's office had expanded since Crow arrived. The new horse. The dinners at Crow's house that Nolan attended and didn't talk about. Nolan wasn't bought so much as he was comfortable, which was sometimes worse because bought men at least knew they were bought and carried the tension of it. Comfortable men had convinced themselves they were just being practical. "Circuit Court Judge," Eliza said. "Judge Harwick out of Hillsborough. He comes through Limestone County 4 times a year. When's his next circuit?" Frank Deaver, who had been surprisingly useful since losing his instinct to charge at things, looked up. "My wife's cousin is the court clerk. Harwick comes through in 8 weeks. 8 weeks. It was tight against Crow's apparent March deadline, but it was something to aim at. 8 weeks to have everything assembled and ready, Eliza said. The drainage maps, the signed statements from all 3 families. I want them written, witnessed, and sealed. The freight receipt. Margaret's notes, which I want copied twice. 1 copy stays here, 1 copy goes with someone Crow doesn't know is involved. She looked around the table. Who in this valley has had no contact with Crow? No dealings? No conversation? Nothing he'd have reason to watch? Silence. Then Agnes Holloway said, that Reverend Marsh's wife, Martha, she doesn't involve herself in land business and she's got nothing Crow wants. She'd keep a copy. Eliza had a brief internal conflict about involving a person whose household she'd rather not bring into danger, and then she thought about the alternative and set the conflict aside. Would she? I'll ask her myself, Agnes said. The meeting broke up 2 hours after it started, and when the families left, they left by different roads at different times, which was Eliza's suggestion, and which nobody argued with. When the last wagon had cleared the south gate, Colton came into the kitchen and stood looking at the table where the papers were still spread out. 8 weeks is a long time, he said. It is. Crow's going to notice that we haven't sold, that the Devers haven't sold. He's going to push harder. I know. The cattle theft last night. He stopped. That was a message as much as a loss. He knows we're talking. He knows we're not moving. Yes. She started gathering the papers, organizing them back into the order she'd need later. Which means the next thing he does will be larger. Colton was quiet for a moment. I should have done something sooner, he said, before you came. I knew something was wrong with the water. I knew the losses didn't make sense. He stopped again. She looked at him. He was not a man who explained himself easily, and she could see what this was costing him. You were managing, she said. 5 children and a dying ranch and a grief that would have leveled most people. You were managing. Margaret was trying to fix it while she was dying, and I didn't even know. No, Eliza said. And she didn't tell you, which means she made a choice. Maybe she was protecting you. Maybe she wasn't ready. Maybe she just didn't have enough yet and didn't want to raise something she couldn't finish. She held his gaze. You can't carry what she didn't give you to carry. He looked at her for a long time. You're not what I expected, he said. I know, she said. Most people aren't what other people expect. She went back to organizing the papers. The next 3 weeks had a particular quality that Eliza would remember afterward as the feeling of a held breath, everything happening under the surface, visible only in small signs if you knew what to look for. Ed Holloway's nephew sent the survey maps in 4 days rather than 3, copied in detail on good drafting paper, showing the exact drainage topology of the ridge parcels and the watershed that fed every east-running creek in the valley. Eliza and Colton spent an evening with the maps and a candle and her ledger, tracing the water routes with their fingers. And when the line from Crow's third parcel to the North Creek of the Voss Ranch was undeniable on paper, Colton sat back and let out a breath that seemed to have been held since March. The signed statements came together slowly, the way things do when you're asking people to put their names on paper that accuses a powerful man of crimes. Carl Beckett signed his readily, with a hard hand. Frank Deaver took 2 days and a second conversation before he signed, which was fine. The Holloways signed together, Ed and Agnes both, their signatures side by side in a way that looked like something had been decided between them privately before they sat down to write. Eliza wrote her own statement. It was the longest of all of them. Not because she had the most to say, but because she included Margaret's materials as exhibits and had to describe how and where she'd found them and in what condition and what they contained. It took her 3 evenings to get it right, and she rewrote the opening paragraph 4 times before she was satisfied it said what it needed to say without saying more. Jace helped her. This surprised her more than almost anything else that had happened since she'd arrived. He came to the kitchen table on the second evening when she was working on the third draft and sat down across from her without invitation, and after watching her write and cross out and write again for 10 minutes, he said, You keep changing the beginning. I need it to be precise, she said. Legal language is about precision. What's wrong with what you have? She pushed the draft across the table. He read it, which itself was something. She hadn't known until that moment whether Jace read well or at all. He read it with his lips not moving and his eyes moving steadily left to right, which was the reading of someone who had done a lot of it. Here, he said, pointing. You say, the compartment appeared to have been constructed with intention. That's weak. Just say the compartment was constructed. You know it was. Appeared as a hedge. She looked at where he was pointing. He was right. Thank you, she said. He pushed the draft back. My mother used to say that hedging in writing is like apologizing before you've done anything wrong. He said it carefully, watching her face to see how she'd receive the mention of Margaret. She was right, Eliza said. Jace picked up the pencil she'd been using and turned it in his fingers. Can I read the rest of it, when it's done? Yes, she said. I'd like that. He put the pencil down and went to bed, and Eliza sat alone at the table for a minute before she went back to writing, and she thought, there he is. That's who he's been under all of it. The trouble she'd been anticipating came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the cattle theft, in the form of Harlan Crow himself. He rode up to the Voss ranch at mid-morning with 2 men behind him and the particular unhurried manner of someone who has never had to hurry because the world has always waited for him. He was wearing a good coat despite the cold being not that severe, which was the kind of thing Eliza noticed. The coat was a signal, like everything else about him, a communication of status designed to precede the actual conversation. She was at this woodpile when he arrived, splitting with the maul, and she did not stop when he rode into the yard. She split the piece she was working on, set another on the block, and split that one too before she set the maul down and straightened up and looked at him. Mr. Crow, she said. Mrs. Voss. He smiled with all the warmth of a sign. I don't believe we've had the pleasure. We haven't, she said. Colton's in the south pasture. I can send someone for him. No need. I came to check in on how you're settling. New to the area, from what I understand. He looked around the yard with the proprietary gaze of a man who is already calculating what something will be worth when it's his. Colton tells me you've had some trouble recently. Cattle losses. He knows exactly what happened. He ordered it. She kept her face entirely still. It's been a difficult season, she said. I understand a lot of families in the valley have had the same trouble. The smile stayed exactly where it was. Frontier living, nothing's guaranteed. He folded his hands on the saddle horn. I've been thinking about making Colton a generous offer on this place. Now that he's got more mouths to feed, the land might be more burden than asset. I'd give him fair value, more than fair. That's kind of you, she said. But we're not looking to sell. Times change, he said. A man might reconsider. He might, she agreed pleasantly, if times change. Right now they haven't. His eyes moved from the yard to her face and stayed there for a moment. And what she saw in them was not anger. Anger would have been better, easier to read. What she saw was assessment, the same thing she did, looking at land or tools or problems. He was looking at her and trying to figure out what she was. You seem like a practical woman, he said. I respect practical women. They understand that sentiment is expensive. I'm very practical, she said. Practical enough to know that 32 cattle don't just walk themselves off a man's land. She said it without inflection, without accusation, just one practical person talking to another. If you hear anything about where they might have gotten to, I'd be grateful to know. The smile didn't change, but his eyes did, very slightly. A small recalculation, a tiny adjustment of how much space he was going to give her. I'll keep my ears open, he said. He left without seeing Colton, which was what she'd intended by handling it herself. She watched the 3 horses until they were off the property, and then she went inside and stood at the kitchen sink for a moment with her hands gripping the edge of the basin, and she let herself feel what she hadn't let herself feel in front of him. The straightforward, uncomplicated fact of how dangerous this man was and how carefully she was going to have to move for the next 5 weeks. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway. Was that him? How do you know about him? Eliza asked. Jace told me. Clara leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed, which was a posture she'd inherited from her father. He's the one poisoning the water. Eliza looked at her. 11 years old, and she'd been listening to everything. We believe so, she said carefully. Did my mother know about him? A pause. Clara deserved the truth. Yes, she was trying to find proof before she died. Clara's expression didn't crumble. She was not a crumbling kind of child, but it tightened the way something tightens when pressure is applied to it. She didn't tell us. She was protecting you, Eliza said. That's what I think. Is that what you do? The question caught her off guard. Its directness, its implication. She thought about it honestly before she answered. Probably not, she said. I'd probably tell you too much. I tend to think people can handle more than we give them credit for. Clara thought about that. I think she was wrong to keep it from us, she said. I think I could have helped. I think you're right, Eliza said. And I think she knew that and was still scared. Even smart people make that mistake. Clara nodded slowly, working through it. Then she looked up. What do you need me to do? Eliza looked at her for a moment. I need the household to be normal, she said. Normal as possible. Crow's watching this place. If it looks like we're preparing for something, he'll move faster. Children at lessons, meals at regular times, nothing changed from the outside. She paused. Can you manage that? Keep the younger ones on schedule? Keep things looking ordinary? Yes, Clara said. No hesitation. Good. Eliza turned back to the basin. Thank you. Clara went. Eliza stood there a moment longer and she thought, Margaret raised remarkable children, all of them, even the angry one, especially the angry one. Colton came back from the south pasture at noon and she told him about Crow's visit, and she watched his face do the things it did when he was trying not to let anger get ahead of thinking. He came here, Colton said. He wanted to look at us, she said, see if we were scared, see if the cattle theft had done enough damage. Had it? Not enough for his purposes, she said, which is why he came. She set a plate in front of him. He's going to do something else. Soon. What? I don't know yet, but we should assume it happens before we're ready and plan for that. Colton ate for a minute in silence. The copies? Martha Marsh has one? Agnes delivered it 4 days ago. The Springhouse has one. Ruth Deaver has the third. She sat across from him. Whatever happens to this house, whatever Crow sends at it, the evidence exists in 3 places he doesn't know about. And the originals? Here. I want them here because if something happens and we need to produce them fast, I don't want to be riding to someone else's house to get them. He looked at her. You're expecting something to happen here. I'm preparing for the possibility, she said. There's a difference. He pushed the plate aside and put his elbows on the table. I want the children out of here, he said. If something's coming, I want them somewhere safe. Where? He thought about it. Deaver Place. Ruth's good with children, and Frank's got enough men to, if Crow's watching us, moving the children will tell him we're expecting something. He'll move immediately. Colton's jaw tightened. So we keep them here. We keep them here and we make sure they know what to do if things go wrong, she said. Clara already knows. Jace, he's 16 and he's been preparing for something like this his whole life, whether he knows it or not. Thomas can ride fast and he knows it. Hank and Rosie, she stopped. Hank and Rosie need a place inside the house that's safe and that they know to go to. The root cellar, Colton said, under the pantry floor. Margaret kept it for storms. Show me. He showed her, and it was better than she'd hoped. Deep enough, solidly built, with a wooden hatch that looked like floor planking if you didn't know it was there. She put a lantern and a water jug and a blanket down there, and she brought Hank and Rosie in to show them where it was and what it was for, keeping her voice calm and practical. If anything ever happens outside, she said, and one of us tells you to go here, you go here. You pull the hatch shut, you stay quiet, you wait. Hank looked at the cellar with wide eyes. What kind of thing would happen? Probably nothing, she said, but a good rancher prepares for what might happen even when it's not likely. You understand? He nodded. Rosie said, Would you come and get us? Yes, Eliza said. She said it without hesitation, without qualification, and she meant it in the complete way that you can only mean some things. Rosie nodded and seemed satisfied. 2 weeks before the circuit judge was due in Hillsborough, something shifted in the way Crow's men moved around the valley. It was the kind of shift that is hard to name but easy to feel. The follower on the road came back. A different one this time, better at it than the last. There was a rider on the ridge above the north pasture 2 evenings in a row. One of Crow's business associates, a man named Pettigrew, who ran the general store and owed everything he had to Crow's investment, started asking casual questions around town about whether the Voss place was having trouble, whether Colton had been seen at the bank, whether the new wife was settling in or making noise about leaving. Ruth Deaver sent word about the questions through Agnes Holloway, and the word arrived on a Thursday morning, and that afternoon Eliza made a decision she'd been building toward without knowing it. She rode to town herself, not to hide, not to avoid being seen, to be seen. She went to the general store and bought 3 things she needed and 1 she didn't, and she spoke to Pettigrew with the easy friendliness of a woman who has nothing to conceal. And she passed the bank and the sheriff's office and the Morrison Hotel, and she let Crow's watchers see that she was present and untroubled. And on her way out of town, she stopped at the land office, and she pulled the public deed records for Crow's 3 ridge parcels, and she read the descriptions carefully, and she took notes. The deeds described the parcels as purchased for agricultural development and range management. The acquisition dates were exactly what Margaret had noted. And there was one additional detail she hadn't had before: a recorded water rights claim filed 2 months after the land purchase that gave Crow's parcels priority access to the ridge drainage. Not the water downstream, just the ridge. But the filing told her something important. Someone had thought carefully about water rights before any lie went into any creek. This was not a crime of opportunity. This had been planned from the beginning. She rode home with the notes in her coat, and the particular cold clarity that comes when a picture you've been building from pieces finally closes into itself, and you can see the whole shape of it. She was a mile from the ranch when she smelled it. Smoke. Not wood smoke, not the kitchen fire or the lamp oil smell of evening. Something larger, something wrong. She put her heels to the mare and rode. The barn was on fire. Not the house, not yet. But the barn was going hard, the dry October wood catching the way wood does when it's been helped to catch. Orange light spilling into the early dark, and she could hear the cattle screaming from the south pasture where they'd fortunately been all day, and she could see Thomas and Jace with bucket lines from the well working the perimeter, trying to keep it from the house. And she could see Colton at the far side beating at the edge of the fire with a wet blanket, and she could hear Rosie crying somewhere inside the house. She pulled up and dismounted, and her mind did the thing it did in moments like this. Went very fast and very still at the same time, sorting what mattered in what order. The house. The children. The documents. "Jace!" she called. He looked up. "Is everyone out of the house?" "Clara's got Rosie and Hank. Thomas is here," Thomas said, appearing from the water line. "We've been keeping the sparks off the roof." "Good. Keep doing it." She tied the mare to the fence post and ran to the house. Clara was in the front room with Rosie on her lap and Hank pressed against her side, all 3 of them watching the fire through the window with faces that were holding together through an act of will. "Everyone's all right?" Eliza asked. "We're all right," Clara said. Her voice was even. "Barely. Stay in here. Keep away from the windows on the east side." She went to her room. The ledger was where she'd left it. The documents, originals, the freight receipt, Margaret's notes, were in the tin box under the floorboard under her cot, which she'd put there after Crow's visit. She pulled up the board, pulled out the tin box, tucked it inside her coat. She went back outside. The barn was lost. She knew it by the time she got out. The roof was already going, the walls folding inward, and there was nothing to be done for it except what the boys were doing, keeping the ember spray off the house roof with water and beating. Colton came around the burning wall and his face was black with smoke, and his eyebrows were singed, and he looked at her with a look that was asking something without words. "Children are fine," she said. "House is holding." He nodded. He looked at the barn. Something moved across his face. Not just the loss of the building, but the weight of what the loss meant. The tack. The winter feed stores they'd managed to put by. The tools. 2 good workhorses that, thank God, had been in the pasture. "He did this," Colton said. Not a question. "He did this," she said. They stood together for a moment watching the fire, and then Colton picked up a bucket and went back to the line, and Eliza picked up the other wet blanket and went to the east wall of the house and started beating sparks, and they worked until there was nothing left of the barn but hot coals and the iron fittings of things that didn't burn, and the house was still standing. At some point in the middle of it, Jace appeared at her elbow and worked beside her without a word, beating sparks from the porch railing, and when she glanced at his face in the firelight, she saw something there that was not a boy's face at all anymore. The fire burned down toward midnight. The family sat in the kitchen, all of them, Colton and Jace and Thomas and Clara and Hank and Rosie, crowded around the table in the smoke smell that had gotten into the house through the windows. And nobody said much because there wasn't much to say that would help. Rosie had fallen asleep against Eliza's arm, her small weight pressed into Eliza's side. Eliza sat and felt that weight, and looked around the table at these 5 people who had started as strangers and were not strangers anymore, and she thought about what Crow had intended with the fire. The message of it, the escalation of it. He was trying to break something. He was trying to make the cost of staying too high. She put her hand on the tin box inside her coat. Everything was still there: the receipt, the notes, the drainage maps in the spring house, the copies with Martha Marsh and Ruth Deaver, Jace's descriptions, the signed statements, all of it intact and distributed across places Crow didn't know to look. He had burned the barn. He had not found the thing that would undo him. "We leave for Hillsborough in the morning," she said. Colton looked at her. "We don't wait for the circuit date," she said. "We go to Harwick directly. A circuit judge has the authority to receive evidence and issue warrants before the formal sitting. We take everything we have and we put it in front of him and we ask for an emergency hearing." She looked around the table at each face. "Crow is going to keep pushing. The longer we wait, the more he does. We go now, before he decides the next step after the barn." Jace said, "All of us?" "You and Clara and Thomas stay here with the younger ones," Colton said. He looked at Eliza. "You and me and Frank Deaver." "And Ruth," Eliza said. "She's a witness to the water situation from the start." Colton nodded. "Jace," she said, and he looked at her with the direct, level attention he'd been giving her since the fire started. "You're in charge here. You know what to do if someone comes on this property who shouldn't." "Yes," he said. She believed him. Outside, the coals of the barn ticked and cooled in the November dark, and somewhere on the North Ridge, Harlan Crow's money and his plans and his careful, patient destruction of an entire valley waited for a response that was already on its way. They left before sunrise. Colton had the wagon hitched by 4 in the morning, working by lantern in the open air where the barn used to be, the ground still warm in places from the previous night's fire. Eliza came out with the tin box inside her coat and her ledger under her arm and a bag that held the drainage maps rolled carefully in oilcloth, and she climbed up onto the seat without being helped, which was the only way she'd ever done anything. Jace stood in the yard to see them off. He had Thomas beside him and Clara behind him with Rosie's hand in hers. And the 5 of them standing there in the dark with the smell of ash still in the air was a picture Eliza would carry for a long time, the shape of what was at stake, given a face. Given 5 faces. "You know what to do," Colton said to Jace. "I know," Jace said. Colton looked at his oldest son for a long moment in the lantern light. He started to say something and stopped, and then he said, "Your mother would be proud of you. She would be genuinely proud." Jace's jaw moved. He nodded once, fast, and looked away. Colton clicked at the horses and they pulled out. They picked up Frank and Ruth Deaver at the junction road, Frank with his signed statement folded inside his jacket and a rifle across his knees, Ruth with a canvas bag that held the copies Eliza had asked her to keep. The duplicate statements, the extra set of Margaret's notes. Frank had not said anything when Eliza had explained about the fire the night before, but she had seen the thing that moved across his face, the particular rearrangement of a man who has been wanting to be angry and has just been given complete permission. The road to Hillsborough was 2 days in good weather, and this was not quite good weather, cold, dry, with a wind that came off the northern plains with nothing to stop it for 300 miles. They drove in shifts, Colton and Frank trading the reins, and they stopped only when the horses needed it, and they ate from what Ruth had packed without getting down from the wagon. Eliza spent the first 4 hours going through the evidence one more time, reading in the wagon-jolted way that gives you a headache but tells you where the weak places are. The freight receipt was solid. The drainage maps were solid. The signed statements were solid. Margaret's notes were compelling but would require explanation. They were the notes of a woman thinking out loud, not a formal document, and a good lawyer could argue they were speculation. What connected everything was the water rights filing, which Eliza had copied from the public record at the land office. That filing, dated 2 months after Crow acquired the ridge parcels, demonstrated planning, demonstrated foreknowledge of the water table, demonstrated that before any lie entered any creek, someone had sat down and thought carefully about exactly where the water went and who depended on it. She wrote a 3-page summary, clear, plain language, no hedging. She remembered what Jace had said about hedging, and she cut every soft word she found. By the time they camped for the night off the main road, the summary was the tightest piece of writing she'd ever done, and she knew it. Ruth sat with her by the small fire after the men had taken the first watch, 2 women in blankets with the wide Texas night above them. "Are you scared?" Ruth asked. Eliza thought about the honest answer. "Yes," she said. "Not of Crow. Of this not being enough. of putting everything we have in front of a judge and having it not be enough. Ruth looked at the fire. Margaret thought it would be enough when she was gathering it. Margaret didn't get to find out. No, Ruth said quietly. She didn't. They sat with that for a while. Then Ruth said, "What happens to your family if this goes wrong?" Eliza understood the "your family" in that sentence and what it meant that Ruth had used it. "The same thing that happens to every family in the valley," she said. "Crow wins. People sell. The valley stops being what it was." She paused. "I'm not willing to let that happen." Ruth looked at her sideways. "You've been there 2 months." "I know. Most people would have left by now." "I don't leave things," Eliza said. It was simple and true, and she didn't have a better explanation than that. They reached Hillsboro the following afternoon, stiff and cold and smelling of road, and went directly to the courthouse. Judge Harwick was not in his chambers. He was at the Morrison Hotel, which was where circuit judges apparently went when they wanted to be not in their chambers. And Colton went to get him, while Eliza and Ruth and Frank waited in the courthouse hallway on a wooden bench, 3 people with the gravity of what they were carrying, making them sit very straight. Harwick came in 20 minutes later, still buttoning his vest, a compact man in his 60s with close-cut white hair and the kind of face that had heard too much to be easily surprised. He looked at the 3 of them, and then at Colton, and then at the rolls of paper under Eliza's arm. "You'd better come in," he said. His office smelled of old paper and tobacco and the particular smell of a room where serious things happen. He sat behind his desk, and Eliza set the oilcloth roll and the tin box and her ledger on the desk in front of him, and she stood and she laid it out. All of it. She did it in the order of the summary she'd written, which was the most logical order. Not dramatic, not emotional, just the chain of evidence from the beginning to the barn fire 2 nights ago. She did not raise her voice. She did not apologize for taking his time. She presented it the way a person presents something they know to be true, without performance, because performance suggests you're compensating for weakness. Harwick listened without interrupting for 30 minutes. At the end, he picked up the freight receipt and looked at it for a long time, and then he picked up the water rights filing copy and looked at that, and then he spread the drainage maps on his desk and traced the watershed with his finger, the way she and Colton had done by candlelight. He looked up at Frank Deaver. "You lost cattle." 43 head between July and October, Frank said, all from East Running Water. "You've got veterinary records?" "Our vet in Meridian documented the last 7. Alkaline poisoning," he said. "Couldn't say how." Harwick looked at the map again. He looked at Margaret's notes, which Eliza had placed last, deliberately. The most human piece of the evidence, the record of a woman's intelligence and determination, left for exactly this purpose. He read through them slowly. "This woman," he said. "She was the deceased wife?" "Yes," Colton said from the corner of the room where he'd been standing without speaking. "She compiled this while ill?" "In her last months," Colton said. "Yes." Harwick set the notes down. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was apparently something he did when he was thinking. Nobody spoke. "Mr. Crow's attorney is a man named Bellard," Harwick said, "out of Austin, and he is very good at his job. What you have here," he gestured at the desk, "is strong circumstantial evidence with one piece of direct documentation. Bellard will attack the freight receipt. He'll argue industrial lie has legitimate agricultural applications. He'll bring experts." Eliza's stomach tightened. "And the drainage maps?" "The drainage maps are compelling. Combined with the water rights filing, they suggest premeditation. That's where your case has teeth." He leaned forward. "What I cannot do on this evidence alone is arrest Harlan Crow. What I can do is issue a temporary injunction against any further land transactions in the affected valley properties, pending investigation. And I can order an independent water test of the ridge drainage, a formal one, conducted by a state-appointed chemist, that Bellard cannot attack as hearsay." Eliza looked at Colton. "That stops him buying more land," Colton said. "For now," Harwick said. "An injunction is not a conviction, but it buys time and it puts him on notice that someone with legal authority is paying attention." He paused. "It also means he knows you've been here. That is a risk you need to understand." "He already knows we're not selling," Eliza said. "He burned our barn." Harwick looked at her steadily. "I'd like that in a supplemental statement. The arson." "I'll write it tonight." He nodded. Come back at 8 in the morning. I'll have the injunction drafted. He stood, which meant the meeting was over, and then he stopped and looked at the desk covered in documents, the maps, the receipt, the notes in Margaret Voss's urgent handwriting, and something moved across his face that was not strictly professional. The woman who gathered this, he said. Did she know what she had? I think she knew it was enough, Eliza said. She just didn't have enough time. Harwick was quiet for a moment. Well, he said, she had enough time to get it to the right place. They spent the night at the Hillsborough boarding house, the four of them in 2 rooms, and Eliza wrote the supplemental arson statement by lamp at the small desk in her room and then lay on the bed without sleeping for several hours, running through every way the next weeks could go wrong. There were many. She ran through them methodically and thought about each one and what the response to it would be, which was not comforting exactly, but was better than lying there just being afraid. She thought about her father. She thought about that morning in the yard, the cattle, the way he'd counted without looking at her. She had not thought about him much since arriving at the Voss ranch. There had been too much else. But in the quiet of the boarding house in Hillsborough, she thought about what it meant that a man could look at his own daughter and see only an asset to be liquidated. She thought, I am not an asset. I am not a liability. I am a person who does what needs doing, and I have been that person my whole life. And it cost my family nothing, and the Voss Ranch everything it has gained in the last 2 months. And the difference is not about me. The difference is about who was willing to see what was in front of them. That was the thing she would carry from this, she thought. Not anger at Silas. She had spent most of her anger on that particular subject years ago, and there was not much left. Just the clear-eyed understanding that a person's worth is not assigned. It is demonstrated. And it takes a certain kind of eyes to see a demonstration when it happens. Colton had those eyes, flawed and grief-worn and still learning how to use them, but he had them. She fell asleep around 3 and woke at 6 feeling like herself, which was all she asked. The injunction was ready at 8. Harwick had also drafted orders for the state chemist, which would take 2 weeks to execute. A man would be sent to take water samples from the ridge drainage and the affected downstream creeks, with the results to be submitted directly to the court. Harwick was precise and thorough, and when he handed over the injunction documents, he said, "This will be served to Crow by the county marshal today. Not Nolan, the county marshal from this jurisdiction. I want you to understand that." "Thank you," Eliza said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "This is the beginning of a legal process, not the end of one. Stay ready." They started home. The ride back was different from the ride there. Frank Deaver was quieter, which in his case meant something closer to satisfied. Ruth sat next to Eliza on the wagon bench for part of the afternoon, and they talked, not about the case, but about ordinary things. Ruth's kitchen garden, the winter preparations she hadn't gotten to, a recipe for dried apple cake that her mother had made. It was the kind of conversation that happens when people have been through something together and need to touch normal life to remember it's still there. Colton drove most of the way back. At one point in the late afternoon, when Frank and Ruth were both dozing in the wagon bed and the road was empty and the light was going gold in the way it does in November in Texas, he said, "My wife's family is in Arkansas, her mother. I wrote to tell them about Margaret passing, but I haven't written again since." Eliza kept her eyes on the road. "You should," she said. "I know. I just don't know what to say that isn't—" He stopped. "Everything I could tell them is about how hard things have been. That feels like the wrong letter to write." "Write them the right letter then," she said. "Tell them about the children. Tell them Jace is becoming someone who surprises you. Tell them Clara is reading everything she can get her hands on, and Thomas can read weather better than any man you know. Tell them Hank took apart the water pump to see how it worked and put it mostly back together." She paused. "Tell them the things that would make Margaret glad." He was quiet for a long moment. "What about Rosie?" "Tell them Rosie said her first words to me after a rabbit stew," she said, and she heard the small thing in her own voice when she said it. The thing she hadn't known was there until it came out. "Tell them she spoke for her brother." Colton drove for a while without speaking. Then he said, "Eliza. I want to say something, and I don't know how to say it without it coming out wrong. Try anyway." He was quiet for another moment, organizing the words with the care of a man who doesn't have many of them. What I thought I was getting when Crow suggested this arrangement, I thought I was getting someone to cook and work. I thought that was all I needed and all I could ask for. And I want to tell you that I know now that what I actually got was—" He stopped. "I don't have the right word for it." "You don't need one," she said. "I think I do," he said. "I think you deserve one." She looked at him then. He was looking at the road, but the line of his face in the afternoon light was open in a way it hadn't been when she'd arrived. The guardedness that grief had built around him worn down in places to something more like the person underneath. "Partners," she said. "That's a word." He turned and looked at her. "That's what I came here to be," she said. "If you're willing." A long pause. The horses moved. The light shifted. "Yes," he said. "That's the word." They got home to find the ranch intact, and Jace sitting on the porch with a rifle across his knees and an expression of profound relief that he immediately replaced with dignity when the wagon pulled in. "Any trouble?" Colton asked. "Pettigrew's man came down the south road twice," Jace said. "Didn't come onto the property. I made sure he saw me each time." "Good," Colton said. Jace looked at Eliza. "Did it work?" "It started working," she said. "There's more to do." He absorbed that. "What do we do now?" "We rebuild the barn," she said. "We fix the fence on the east pasture. We get the winter feed situation sorted." She climbed down from the wagon. "We go back to work, and we let the law do its part." Rosie had appeared in the doorway. She looked at Eliza across the yard with those grave, lake-colored eyes. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," Eliza said. Rosie came off the porch and crossed the yard and put her arms around Eliza's waist, and Eliza stood very still for a moment before she put her hand on the child's hair, and that was that. Harlan Crow did not take the injunction quietly. His attorney Bellard filed a response within a week, citing the injunction as an overreach based on insufficient evidence, and Crow himself continued to appear in town with the unhurried manner of a man who believes legal processes are inconveniences that money eventually resolves. He stopped by the Morrison Hotel the day after the injunction was served, and he held court there with the ease of someone who has never genuinely believed he could lose, and the people who orbited his money hovered around him and agreed with everything he said, and from the outside it would have looked like nothing had changed. But the state chemist arrived in Limestone County 12 days after the injunction, a precise young man from Austin named Cortland, who had the unsentimental focus of someone who cares only about what the water actually contains, and not at all about who prefers it to contain what. He took samples from the ridge drainage at 3 points, from the North Creek of the Voss Ranch, from the Deaver East Creek, from 2 points on the Holloway and Beckett water sources, and from a control sample at the county well in town. He spent 4 days in the valley taking his samples, and he said almost nothing to anyone, and he sent his results directly to Harwick's office in Hillsboro. Eliza heard about the results through Agnes Holloway, who heard from her nephew, who heard from the court clerk. The ridge drainage showed alkaline compound concentrations 40 times above natural threshold. The downstream water sources showed concentrations that correlated precisely with their distance from the ridge. Closer to the ridge, higher concentration, exactly as you would predict if the contamination were coming from a fixed point above. It was not circumstantial. Bellard tried anyway. He brought an expert from Dallas who testified that alkaline concentrations in ridge drainage could have natural geological causes, and Harwick let him testify and then presented the chemist's comparison of pre-Crow survey data showing the ridge drainage had tested within normal parameters 18 months earlier, and the Dallas expert had nothing useful to say about that. Eliza was in Hillsboro for the preliminary hearing, sitting in the back of the small courtroom with Colton on one side and Ruth Deaver on the other, watching the thing she had been building for 2 months be tested against a powerful man's lawyers and money and connections. It was not comfortable. Bellard was as good as Harwick had said, and there were moments when she felt the ground shift under the case, when some line of questioning opened a gap she hadn't anticipated, and she sat there making herself stay still and not react. But the freight receipt held. The drainage maps held. And when Harwick entered Margaret's notes into the record, over Bellard's objection, sustained then overruled, and read aloud the line about the March deadline overheard by a dead woman who had been sick and still paying attention, the courtroom went very quiet. Crow, sitting at the defense table with his good coat and his easy posture, went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. the still of a man who has just heard the sound of the thing underneath him starting to give way. Harwick did not render a verdict that day. What he rendered was a finding of probable cause, which meant a full trial would be scheduled, which meant Crow's injunction became permanent pending trial, which meant no land purchases, no foreclosures, no forced sales in Blackthorn Valley for the foreseeable future. He also referred the matter of the cattle theft. Jace's descriptions matched two men in Crow's known employ, to the county marshal for investigation, bypassing Sheriff Nolan entirely. It was not a complete victory. Eliza had understood going in that a complete victory was not what a preliminary hearing could give you, but it was the door opening, and beyond the door was a room she intended to walk all the way through. Crow's operation in the valley did not survive the wait for trial. The mechanism was not dramatic. It was the slow withdrawal of the kind of cooperation that powerful men depend on without knowing they depend on it. The store clerk who stops extending credit, the banker who stops returning calls, the business associate who suddenly has a conflict of interest in being seen at Crow's dinner table. When a man's power is built on the assumption that it cannot be challenged, the first serious challenge does more damage than the size of the challenge would suggest, because everyone watching recalibrates what is possible. Two of Crow's ranch hands came forward to the county marshal in February, separately and for different reasons, and what they described in their statements filled the last gaps in the case. The specific methodology of the lie distribution, the timeline, the instructions that had come from Crow directly, documented in a way that left Bellard with nothing useful to stand behind. Harlan Crow was convicted at trial in March. 7 months after Eliza Marlowe had arrived at the Voss Ranch with one bag and a ledger and the clear-eyed understanding that she had nowhere else to go and no choice but to make something out of where she was. The conviction covered criminal conspiracy, destruction of property, and the unlawful taking of livestock. He was sentenced to 6 years in the state penitentiary, and his properties in Blackthorn Valley were liquidated by court order, with the proceeds distributed to the families whose losses were documented in the trial record. It was not everything those families had lost. It never is, when the accounting is done in money. You cannot give back the cattle, cannot give back the months of fear and uncertainty, cannot give back the woman who died in March with her notes hidden in a secret compartment and her questions still unanswered. But it was justice, which is not the same as restoration, but is the closest thing the living can get. Eliza heard the verdict in the courtroom in Hillsborough, with Colton's hand covering hers on the bench between them. Not a romantic gesture, not a signal of anything except that two people who have been through something large are sometimes moved to touch, the way you reach for a fence post when the ground tips. She did not cry. She had not cried in front of anyone in longer than she could remember, and she was not going to start in a courtroom in Hillsborough. But when they walked out into the March daylight, she stopped on the courthouse steps and stood there for a moment with the sun on her face, and she let herself feel the full size of it. The 2 months of preparation, the fire, the cold road, the sleepless nights, the freight receipt, and the drainage maps and Margaret's handwriting pressed hard into paper, all of it arriving at this moment on these steps in the first real warmth the season had offered. Colton stood beside her and said nothing, which was the right thing. The valley recovered the way valleys do, slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and complications that don't get mentioned when people tell the story later. The Deavers rebuilt their herd over 2 years. The Holloways lost their oldest cow to a completely unrelated illness in the spring, which was the kind of thing that happens when you expect the universe to have learned a lesson it hasn't. The Becketts had a difficult harvest, then a good one, then a difficult one again, which is the rhythm of farming, and has been since the first person put a seed in the ground and waited to see what happened. The Voss Ranch rebuilt the barn in April, with help from every family in the valley, which took 4 days and produced a structure that was better than the original because Thomas had opinions about the framing that turned out to be correct. Hank helped hold boards and dropped a hammer on his own foot, and hobbled around for a week with a dignity that was almost worth the injury. Rosie brought water to the workers and took the responsibility so seriously that she developed her own system involving a wooden yoke she'd made from a forked branch, which was impractical but showed initiative. Clara turned 12 in May and asked for books, and Eliza ordered 3 from a catalog and paid for them with money she'd earned doing bookkeeping for 2 other ranchers in the valley. A small business that had started because Ed Holloway had mentioned to someone that the Voss woman kept books better than anyone he'd seen outside a bank, which was the kind of reputation that arrives sideways without announcement. Jace was 17 by the time the trial concluded, And what he was becoming by then was visible in the way that growth is visible when you've been watching it happen. Not sudden, not dramatic, but real and solid and yours in the way that only things you've built yourself are yours. He made mistakes. He was impatient with Thomas in ways that required talking about. He had his father's tendency to go silent when he was working something through rather than speaking it, which was fine, as a personal habit and problematic as a management style when you were trying to run a cattle operation with other people. These were real flaws, and they did not disappear. But he worked, and he thought, and he held himself accountable in the specific way of people who have learned that accountability is not weakness. It's just the price of being someone other people can rely on. He told Eliza once, late in the summer after the trial, that he'd been wrong about her. They were repairing the north fence, the same fence she'd been fixing when Ruth Deaver had ridden up for the first time. And he said it without preamble, the way he said most things that mattered. "I know," she said. "I made it hard on purpose." "I know that too." He hammered a staple into the fence post, checked the tension on the wire. "I thought if I made it hard enough you'd leave and things would go back to how they were before." "Before what? Before your mother died?" He was quiet for a moment. "Before everything changed." She understood that. She had spent most of her own childhood trying to make something unchangeable out of things that had already changed. "Things don't go back," she said. "They just go forward in different shapes." Jace pulled the wire taut and held it while she set the next staple. "She would have liked you," he said. "My mother." Eliza set the staple carefully. "Why do you think so?" "Because you're the kind of person she was. You notice things. You keep track." He paused. "You finish what you start." She could not think of anything to say that would be adequate, so she said nothing, and they worked the rest of the fence line in the comfortable silence of two people who don't need to fill the space between them. Silas Marlowe wrote her a letter in July. She received it through the postal relay, and she opened it in her room and she read it, and it said what she supposed she had expected it to say, that he'd heard about the trial, that he was glad she'd come through it well, that the Marlowe farm was doing better now, and perhaps someday she might come and visit. It was the letter of a man who is not going to apologize because he doesn't believe he did anything wrong, and has worked out a story in which his choices were reasonable, and wants his daughter back, not because he has reconsidered his assessment of her, but because her proximity has become valuable in a new way. She wrote back. She told him she was glad the farm was doing better. She told him about the ranch and the children and the valley. She did not go back to visit that year or the year after that, because she was building something, and you do not step away from the thing you are building every time someone calls. But she did not close the door entirely, because she had learned, was still learning, that the people who fail you are very rarely the whole story of who they are, and the accounting of a life is complicated, and she was not willing to reduce her father to the worst thing he had ever done to her, any more than she was willing to be reduced to the worst thing that had ever been done to her. That was harder than any of the rest of it, actually. Harder than the evidence and the trial and the barn fire. The continuing decision not to let her history make her smaller than she was. She did not always succeed at that. There were days when the old diminishment came back, when she heard her father's voice in her own head doing its arithmetic, assigning her worth by some external measure she didn't meet. Those days she worked harder, not as punishment, but because the physical reality of what her hands could do was a very effective argument against the voice. Colton knew about those days eventually. Not because she told him directly, but because she told him the shape of them over time, in the sideways way that people who have both been damaged tell each other things. Through what they said about other subjects, through the things they referenced, and the things they avoided. He did not try to fix her on those days. He had enough sense for that. He was also not above telling her when she was being harder on herself than the evidence warranted, which was the right kind of partner to be. They were not a simple marriage, if marriage was the word for what they made of the arrangement they'd been given. They were two damaged, practical, stubborn people trying to build something that would last, and they disagreed about things, and they had to learn each other the slow way because there was no shortcut, and there were evenings when the silence between them was not comfortable but strained, when one of them had said the wrong thing, and the other had received it wrong, and the repair took longer than it should have. But there were also evenings when the silence was exactly right, when they sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the children's sounds from the back of the house, and the particular piece of a place that has been fought for and won and is still, for now, yours. Eliza thought sometimes about what Margaret Voss had known, and what she'd done with it, and what it had cost her. She thought about the freight receipt hidden in the oilskin in the apple box, waiting for someone with enough time and enough fight left in them to find it. She thought about the terrible faith of that, hiding something you might not live to use and trusting the future to be equal to the task. She did not consider herself to be the answer to Margaret's faith. She was just the person who had come along at the right moment with the right skills and the right irreplaceable lack of options. That was what she thought when she was thinking straight. When she was not thinking straight, sometimes she thought that maybe the universe, whatever it was, had a sense of sequencing, that it put the right people in the right places not because it cared exactly, but because the pieces that fit together sometimes find each other if enough time passes. She could not prove that. She had no receipt for it, no drainage map. It was not the kind of thing that went in a ledger, but she thought it sometimes on the good evenings when the children were in bed and the lamp was burning low and the Texas night was full of stars that burned without caring what burned beneath them, and beside her the man who had been given to her as a transaction was instead her chosen person, imperfect and real and present in the particular way that only the people who have stayed are present. She opened the ledger one of those nights, and she looked at the first entry she'd made, that night on the wagon when she'd sat on her cot for 30 seconds, and then got up because there was work to do. She read through the pages, all of them, the fence inventory, the water notes, the Margaret entries, the meeting records, the evidence catalog, the supplemental arson statement, the verdict date in March. The last entry she'd made was 2 days after the verdict. It read, "North fence complete, south pasture good, water clean." She looked at those 3 sentences for a long time. Then she picked up the pencil, and underneath them she wrote a fourth, "Still here." She closed the ledger and put it on the windowsill and blew out the lamp, and in the dark, the ranch breathed around her. The cattle and the repaired barn, and the kitchen garden coming back, and the 5 children sleeping their different sleeps, and the man down the hall who had said the word partners on a cold road in November, and meant it, and Eliza Marlowe, who had been traded for cattle and had expected nothing and had built everything, sat in the dark and felt the full, complicated, unfinished, irreplaceable weight of a life that was hers. Not assigned, not inherited, not bargained for. Built. One day at a time, one fence post at a time, one child fed and one debt paid and one piece of evidence gathered by lantern light, while the world outside tried to convince her that she was worth less than what she was. She had never believed it. That was the whole story, finally. Not the trial or the evidence or the villain's fall. The whole story was a woman who had never, not once, believed the number her father had put on her. And what happens when that kind of woman finds a place worth staying?